Well, it's good to be with you. I'm away for the next 2 Sabbaths over down at camp, so I will be back with you again on October 6th, sort of 3 Sabbaths time. And looking forward to continuing our journey then on the life of King David, as we are this morning. The title of my sermon this morning is Ground Zero. And if I could just get my first slide up, Jeff, that would be great. On August the 6th, 1945, the nuclear age was sprung upon the human race. The Enola Gay dropped the nuclear bomb over the city of Hiroshima, and the point of impact became known as Ground Zero. And this building that you're looking at here was known as it's like the Provincial Industrial Exhibition Hall. The building was one of the few concrete structures in Hiroshima that day that withstood the blast. The actual point of detonation was 600 metres directly above that building and 150 metres to the left. Everyone in that building, along with 70,000 other people in the city, perished instantly, and a further 70,000 died from radiation poisoning in the weeks and months ahead. That building still stands today. They toyed with the idea of pulling it down, but eventually they decided, no, we want to leave this here as a reminder of that event. And you can see there's a bit of a plaque there with the actual picture of the original building as it was, and to this day, that's the only structure that survived that blast. And just near that park, where that little river is there is the actual point directly below what was the detonation point of that bomb, and it is known as Ground Zero. Well, in more recent times, of course, we have come to associate the term Ground Zero with the place that was the remains of the Twin Towers in New York that were brought down on September 11, 2001. And all the demolition and cleaning up and recovery work on that site became known as Ground Zero. And if you go there today into New York City, you can see there are two large pools that are actually directly the footprint of where those two towers once stood. And there are fountains that go into each of those pools, recirculating pumps that bring the water back up to the surface. And around the edge of each of those pools are the names of every person who perished in that building. So there's two buildings, there's two sets of names of every person who perished that day, nearly 4,000 individuals. And when the memorial was dedicated, many of you may recall the picture of the father who found the name of his son on that plaque and collapsed in weeping with his hand on the plaque. And indeed, it became a symbol of what is Ground Zero. And we find David now in a place in his life where he's about to hit rock bottom. He's about to find himself spiritually at Ground Zero because his world is about to cave in. And if you want to follow along with me, I'm in 1 Samuel chapter 27. And after years on the run, and that was the last time we looked at the story of King David, we looked at his wilderness years on the run from King Saul, who was pursuing his life. After years of being on the run, and after 2 exchanges with Saul where he actually spares Saul's life, they conclude that encounter with Saul saying these words to David in chapter 26 and verse 25. Saul saying, "May you be blessed, my son David. You will do great things and surely triumph." And then the very next chapter begins with these words, "But David thought to himself." But David thought to himself. In other words, David was about to make a decision based on what he thought was right in his own eyes. And that's a term that we used a lot when we looked at our series on the book of Judges. David is about to make a decision based on his own perceptions rather than submitting to what God wanted for his life. Rather than asking God, what is the course for my life? The story begins with David thinking to himself. And what does he think? He thinks, regardless of the evidences of God's providence and protection throughout his wilderness years, regardless of the fact Saul himself could even admit that David would one day be king, David thought to himself that one of these days he would indeed be destroyed by the hand of Saul. And so he makes a decision, a radical decision, and one that's going to have consequences for him and the group of followers that are with him at that point in his life. The Bible tells us that David decided the best thing he could do was escape to the land of the Philistines. David was about to cross over to living amongst his pagan neighbours. He's going to immerse himself in an idolatrous culture and hope that he can disappear in the crowd. David is about to exchange the smile of God for the grin of the enemy. He's about to exchange the trust in the living God for the flimsy walls of a city known as Gath. And there he finds himself living amongst his very enemy. David went from telling lies to actually living a lie. And if you follow the story, you'll find that he then asks King Achish of Gath if he can have his own place to stay. And so King Achish gives him the little town of Ziklag. And from there, David goes out on some exploits of conquering and massacring tribes that live in the Negev desert south of Israel. He's actually attacking some of Israel's enemies, among them the Amalekites. But in doing so, he's coming home with lots of trophies of war, and he gives them to King Achish. And the king asks him, "Where have you been?" And he tells him that he's been raiding Israelite territory. David finds himself living a life of duplicity. He goes from telling lies to living a life that is a lie. And the price of protection that King Achish offered him in his territory was very high, because the price of duplicity was one that would drain nearly all of David's spiritual passion. Says the king, "He's become so odious to his own people that he will be my servant forever." And then in chapter 28, we find David now is in league with the very forces of evil that are trying to destroy God's people. There he is. It says in chapter 28, verse 1, "In those days the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel, and Achish said to David, 'You must understand that you and your men must accompany me in the army.' And David said, 'Then you'll be able to see for yourself what your servant could do.' And Achish says, 'Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life.'" And I could imagine David sitting there thinking, what on earth am I doing? Because he's about to go into battle against the Lord's anointed. All his life, he had respected the office that Saul held. Even if he struggled to have respect for the man, he respected the office that Saul held as king of Israel, the anointed of the Lord. And now he himself is about to do the devil's bidding in destroying the Lord's anointed. What was I thinking? David must have been saying to himself, how on earth am I going to get myself out of this situation? Well, it's right about this time that God's, we say, prevenient grace is extended to David. In other words, God had it in hand, even if David hadn't asked for his deliverance. God had the situation in hand because despite his folly, despite his stupidity, God still believed in him as the future ruler of his people. And God was able to deliver David from this very sticky situation that he now found himself in. And we call that prevenient grace. And we read in chapter 29, the Philistines gathered their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching near at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, what about these Hebrews? Achish replied, isn't this David, who was an officer of King Saul of Israel? He's already been with me over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him. But the Philistine rulers become angry and ask that David and his men be sent back home. Now, if you look at a map of Israel at that time, David had been living in Ziklag. King Achish lived in Gath. The Philistine army had assembled at Aphek near the coast, because the Philistines pretty much controlled this territory. And the battle was going to take place up near the plain of Jezreel in northern Israel, which is where the Israelites were camped. And when the Israelite army finally fled before the Philistines, they went and stood on Mount Gilboa, and that's where King Saul met his fate at the hand of the Philistine archers. And David gets a release from his military duty. So Achish, verse 6 of chapter 29, Achish called David and said to him, as surely as the Lord lives, you've been reliable, and I'd be pleased to have you serve in the army with me. From the day you've come until now, I found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve. So turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers. But what have I done? Asked David. What have you found against your servant to this day until now? He's still having to live the lie. He's still got to keep up appearances that he's now thrown in his lot with the Philistine rulers. Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? And Achish says, this is how good a bluff he'd pulled on Achish. I know you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. David was living a lie, but he was dead on the inside, spiritually. And he was so good at bluffing the king that the king thought he was an angel of God, or likened him to an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders had said, he must not go with us into battle. Now get up early along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it's light. And so David and his men got up early in the morning and went back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Well, at this point, David's probably thanking his lucky stars. He's probably taking the journey home, which would have taken about 3 days to walk the 80 kilometres from Aphek down to Ziklag. All the way, he's probably just breathing the hugest, biggest sigh of relief. It's like he managed to pull that one off again. But what he doesn't know is that his double life is finally about to catch up with him. And as he crested the hill and Ziklag came into view, David's world came crashing down. The roof caved in on his duplicity. There was the smoking ruins of what had been their huts and homes, their animal stalls, their wells, their storage sheds were nothing but smoking ruins, and not a person or an animal to be seen. Chapter 30, David and his men reached Ziklag on the 3rd day, and the Amalekites had raided come and raided, and they had attacked Ziklag and burned it and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They'd killed none of them, but they'd carried them off as plunder of war as they went on their way. Well, David and his men are absolutely distraught. In verse 4 we read, David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. Have you ever been in a place in your life where you're all cried out and you've got nothing left to cry? No energy left even to cry. This is where David found himself, and his men start whispering amongst themselves, it's all his fault. It's all David's fault. He's the one who's created this situation and placed us in the circumstances we are in now. And they began talking amongst themselves about stoning David to death. Talk about being at rock bottom. And he was about to experience what it means to be at rock bottom as his men started to finger the rocks on the ground. Yes, indeed, their families had all been taken captive. But the very next phrase tells us David found strength in the Lord his God. When you've reached rock bottom and there's no place else but to look up, that's the place you and I sometimes have to get to in our lives until we acknowledge our dependence upon God and his prevenient grace even in our own lives. David found strength in the Lord his God. And the very next thing he does is ask Abiathar the priest to inquire of God on his behalf. Something that he probably should have done 12 or 18 months earlier when he made that decision to go over, to cross over and to live amongst an idolatrous people. He didn't consult God then, and now he's living with the consequences of that. But this time he found strength in the Lord his God, and he inquired of God. And God not only answered with a promise, God not only answered, he also answered with a promise that they would recover everything that had been lost. In this period of David's life, there are no psalms that are attributed to the experience that he's going through right now. We're reading through the book of Psalms in our prayer meeting on a Wednesday night, and often you'll come across a little subscript title, an introduction to each of the Psalms, and it'll tell us what the copiers who copied these Psalms believe must have been happening in David's life at that time. This relates to his experience here. This relates to his experience there. But in this period of David's life, there are no recorded Psalms. Is it possible that Israel's singer is silent at this time because he no longer has joy in his heart? He no longer has passion in his heart. Because anyone who is musical knows that if you don't have passion in your life, if you don't have passion in your life, it's very hard to make music. But if this story tells us nothing, it tells us that it's never too late. While there's life, it's never too late to turn back to God. I want to suggest to you that there's a couple of untitled Psalms that I do think do speak to David's experience right at this time. And I want to just share one of them with you, because I think it'll help you appreciate the thought processes of this man. Psalm 31. Perhaps you'd like to follow along with me in your Bible. Psalm 31. In you, O Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness. Turn your ear to me. Come quickly to my rescue. Be my rock of refuge, a strong fortress to save me. Since you are my rock and fortress, for the sake of your name, lead and guide me. Free me from the trap that is set before me, for you are my refuge. Into your hands I commit my spirit. Redeem me, O Lord, the God of truth. I hate those who cling to worthless idols. I trust in the Lord. I will be glad and rejoice in your love, for you saw my affliction and you knew the anguish of my soul. You have not handed me over to the enemy, but you have set my feet in a spacious place. Be merciful to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eyes grow weak with sorrow, and my soul and my body with grief. My life is consumed with anguish, and my years by groaning. My strength fails me because of my affliction, and my bones grow weak. Because of all my enemies, I am the utter contempt of my neighbours. I am a dread to my friends, and those who see me on the street flee from me. I am forgotten by them as though I were dead. I have become like broken pottery. I hear the slander of many. There is terror on every side. They conspire against me and they plot to take my life. But I trust in you, O Lord. I say you are my God. My times are in your hands, and deliver me from my enemies and from those who pursue me. Let your face shine on your servant. Save me in your unfailing love. Let me not be put to shame, O Lord, for I have cried out to you. But let the wicked be put to shame and lie silent in the grave. Let their lying lips be silenced, for with pride and contempt they speak arrogantly against the righteous. How great is your goodness, for which you have stored up for those who fear you, which you bestowed in the sight of men on those who take refuge in you. In the shelter of your presence you hide them from the intrigues of men. In your dwelling you keep them safe from accusing tongues. Praise be to the Lord, for he has showed his wonderful love to me. When I was in a besieged city, in my alarm I said, I am cut off from your sight, yet you have heard my cry for mercy, when I called to you for help. Love the Lord, all you saints. The Lord preserves the faithful, but the proud he pays back in full. Be strong and take heart, all you who hope in the Lord. And while it is true that we reap what we sow, we reap the consequences of our actions, God's grace and God's forgiveness is still available to all of us. Even when you have reached rock bottom and there is no place else but to look up, God's mercy is still available to every single one of us. It is never too late to turn back to God. In 1998, a man by the name of Brian Wolfe was living in Oregon on the west coast of America. And he had a 2-year-old daughter by the name of Brittany. And his wife, Tracy, had just come off night duty, so she was sleeping at home. So he took his daughter for a drive and they went out into the country, out into the woods. They were just going to spend a nice, quiet day together, have some father-daughter time while Mum was sleeping off her night shifts. He was due to start work that evening at his job. And he pulled into a clearing, and it was just a beautiful little wooded area with a lake and some nice grassy bank. And he sat down with his daughter there in the sunshine, and they were looking for beavers in the water, because every now and then the beavers would sort of come up and disappear. And they were just having a beautiful time out there in nature. And for a while, he looked around and he thought about the God who'd created it all. But it had been a long time since Brian had been on talking terms with God. It had been a long time since he had stepped inside a church. God was really not a part of his life anymore. He was living the good life. Double income, nice home, nice car, a beautiful wife, his lovely little daughter. He didn't really need God in his life. While he was sitting there that day, he remembered that in the back of his pickup truck was his new rifle that he had brought, that he hadn't used that much. And he saw this old tree stump and he thought, gee, it'd be nice to get the rifle out and have a bit of fun. So he picked up his 2-year-old daughter and he sat her back in her child's seat in the car. He didn't buckle her in. He just sat her back in the child's safety seat. He got his rifle out from behind the seat. He found an old can and an old plastic bottle on the ground near the edge of the water, and he walked up to that tree stump and he sat him on the tree stump. Went back to his car, leaned on the bonnet of his car and took aim with his rifle, and very easily dispatched of the can and the water bottle. And they went down inside the log. And he thought, well, that was a bit of fun. I should go and get them out, retrieve them, get them out again, and I'll sit them on the log and I'll have a couple of more shots. When he got the bottle and the can, as he leaned over to get the bottle and the can out, the rotten tree stump gave way and he was left tottering right on the edge. He struggled to get out, and as he did, he slipped and went head first into the tree stump. And now he was in a real predicament because his right arm was pinned against his body and the edge of the tree stump. He only had his left arm free, which was the one he was trying to reach down to pick up the bottle with. The more he struggled, the further he slipped in. And by this time, only his toes were hanging on the edge of the tree stump. His head was buried in a pile of decomposing tree stump, moss, vegetation, and by now, as he was finding out, an ant's nest. The ants started to crawl all over his eyes, into his nose, into his mouth. He was brushing them off with his one free hand and with all his might trying to push himself up out of this tree stump while he had his toes hooked on the edge. But it was no use. His body weight was more than he could do with one arm. He started scratching at the soft side of the tree stump inside, and he thought, I'll be able to dig my way out. But then his fingers eventually hit the hard surface of the outer timber of that stump, and he wasn't going anywhere. It was about this time that he, with his head absolutely pumping because he was upside down and he'd been struggling around, he was just a lather of sweat. It was about this time he heard a little voice going, "Daddy, Daddy." His daughter had got out of the car and was wandering around near the lake's edge, 2 years of age. At this point, he screamed his lungs out inside that muffled, hollow tree stump to his daughter to get back in the car. And he was thrashing about, doing everything he could to try and get himself up. The more he moved, the further he got wedged in, like a cork in a bottle inside that tree stump. And for the first time in years, he said a prayer to God. He said, "God, I don't care what happens to me. Could you please keep my little daughter away from that lake?" He hadn't told anyone where he was going. Hadn't left a note to his wife that he was taking a trip into the forest. Nobody. There was nobody around for miles. Nobody knew they were there. And eventually, sobbing his heart out to God and the circumstances he found himself in, he actually passed out. Maybe it was the pressure of all the blood in his brain. I don't know. The next thing he knew, he heard a male voice saying, "Hey, buddy, do you need some help?" He felt two pairs of hands grab each ankle and lift him out of that tree stump. He collapsed on the ground. His head was just absolutely spinning because it felt like a pumpkin. He looked at his watch and he'd been in there for 6 hours. And the first thing he said to these guys, "Where's my little girl?" They said, "Don't worry. We found her. She's safe. She went to sleep on the grassy bank next to that lake." The two guys were forestry workers, and it was actually on a Saturday, so no one around. They'd been doing some clearing on forestry trails, and they had a bulldozer, and they were about to park up the bulldozer for the weekend just around a little bit around the edge of the lake on another spur. And for some reason, as they hopped in their pickup to drive back home, they don't know why, but they felt impressed to take a detour down that little track, and there they found his abandoned ute. And they thought, this is strange. And then they saw the gun on the bonnet, and they thought, this is even stranger. And then they saw his little girl asleep on the grass in the warm afternoon sun. Then they started looking around. Car, gun, kid, there must be a parent somewhere. And they saw his boots sticking up out of the tree stump, and they thought he must have taken his boots off, sat them up there, and gone for a swim in the lake. And so they wondered if he had drowned. And eventually they walked up to the tree stump to pick up the boots, and when they found the boots were still attached, they lifted him out. Brian hadn't given much thought to God in his life for a long, long time. But that day, he reached out to God in the midst of his own despair. Literally, his world had caved in around him and had suffocated him, and he was buried upside down in a tree stump. And he realised that life without God was really pretty futile. You can imagine how grateful he was that nothing had happened to his little girl. And his own testimony to this day, he went back home with a whole different perspective on life, a whole new appreciation for God's prevenient grace in his life. Maybe you found yourself at ground zero. Maybe you found yourself, at rock bottom. Maybe you've lived a double life and it's finally caught up with you and you're wondering, how can I ever get out of this mess? Maybe the roof has caved in on your life through no fault of your own, and you wonder, how can you ever recover from experiences like this? Can I suggest to you that the only place you can turn is to find strength in the Lord your God. The only place you have to go is to find grace and forgiveness. The only place you have to go is to throw yourselves into the arms of God and find strength in his purpose for your life. Perhaps more than anything else, it is the hope that we have as Christians. And quite coincidentally, Scott, one of the verses I had written down was Jeremiah 29, verse 11. Yes, we can take it out of context, but that verse reveals to us God's intention towards us. It reveals what the heart of God is like. I know the plans that I have for you, says the Lord. Plans not to harm you, but to prosper you and to give you hope and a future. And Paul the Apostle picked up on these words. He was writing to the church in Corinth. His first letter, it was actually his second letter to him, but we have it as 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He's talking about the resurrection. And he says, if there's no resurrection, our faith is futile and you're still dead in your sins. And he says, if only in this life we have hope in Christ, we're to be pitied more than all men. But Paul knows that it's more than just this life. We have hope for eternity, don't we? As Christians, we have hope. And the Bible closes with a picture in the book of Revelation of God wiping every tear from our eyes, because there is no more death or mourning or sorrow or pain. We do have hope. We do have strength that we can find in God alone. Regardless of the circumstances you find yourself in now, regardless of whether you are at rock bottom or your roof has caved in, you at least have some hope for the future. And may that hope fill you with so much joy and purpose that you know that your struggles now are but short and momentary compared with all eternity that God has in store for you. Psalm chapter 40. Let me just share two stanzas of Psalm 40 with you. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he turned to me and he heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire, and he set my feet on a rock. He gave me a firm place to stand, and he put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not look to the proud, to those who turn aside to false gods. Many, O Lord my God, are your wonders that you have done. The things you planned for us, no one can recount to you. Were I to speak of them, there would be too many to declare. My prayer for you this morning is that you will, regardless of where you find yourself right now, you will indeed find strength in the Lord your God. May God bless you.